Ethiopia as a whole, and Tigray in particular, were food secure. This entire very sophisticated system was intact. It was comprehensively dismantled.
Some lessons, I think, to be learned from the Yugoslav example. And if the Ethiopians are not careful, that kind of fragmentation could happen.
Welcome to Network 2020's audio edition of this virtual event. Be sure to check out our other events, media, and videos at network2020.org.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion on Ethiopia and Tigray and why the conflict matters for the Horn of Africa and actually, indeed, the world. So thank you all for joining us. We're very lucky to have two excellent experts with us today. Before I introduce them, I will just say a few words about Network 2020 for those of you who don't know. So we are a nonprofit organization based in New York, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. And we leverage entrepreneurial, established and emerging leaders to drive innovative research and solutions critical to impacting foreign policy challenges. So that means a number of different things. We run educational programs like this virtual briefing series, as well as on-the-ground research and other programs as well. So please take a look at our website and follow us on all those social media as well. It's a great honor to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Ambassador David Shinn. He is a professor at the George Washington University, but notably he spent a nearly 4-decade career in the Foreign Service, largely looking at the Horn of Africa, and has all the credentials that go along with it. I am going to be very concise about the bios in order to leave more time for the discussion, but needless to say, we're very lucky to have someone with his expertise. And in addition, we also have Professor Alex de Waal, who's the Executive Director at the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School at Tufts. And he has done a lot of research in the area as well. And has been working in the region for decades. I do want to say that we did make a lot of effort to try to find someone who could speak to us from the ground, but due to a lot of political sensitivities, we really weren't able to do that. But we're very lucky to have both Ambassador Shinn and Professor de Waal, who are very connected and can relay some of the messages of what they're hearing as well. We're also fortunate to have Joanna Waschowski to moderate this conversation. She's a long-term Network 2020 member and has done work in numerous aspects of foreign policy over the years. And so she will be guiding us through this conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Joanna, with a big thanks to Ambassador Shinn and Professor de Waal.
Thank you so much, Courtney. So today we will be discussing with our panelists the role of Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa and specifically the crisis in its Tigray region. We will explore the roots of the conflict, what is happening on the ground, what are likely outcomes, and how the conflict could impact Ethiopia's neighbors. In 2018, Prime Minister Abiy was celebrated for signing a peace agreement with Eritrea, ending a 20-year border war and for releasing prisoners. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, and there was great hope, both within and outside of Ethiopia, that positive developments were coming to the country. Abiy was hailed as a reformist, steering Ethiopia away from ethnic strife and dictatorial rule towards a new democratic era. But in 2020, everything seemed to change, with opposition leaders being arrested in international elections and a government-led military incursion into Tigray. So the question is, what happened? So I'd like to turn to you first, Ambassador Shinn. For background, could you please provide a very brief history of the region and Ethiopia's role in that history, and how that history has led to the current crisis in Tigray?
Sure, happy to do that, Joanna. I'm going to pick it up in 1974 and very quickly bring it up to the future. 1974 was the end of the imperial government in Ethiopia, where Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown by a military junta. The U.S. had very close relations with Haile Selassie, was replaced by Mengistu Haile Mariam eventually, who was in charge of the military group. Mengistu led a very left-wing government, had very poor relations with the United States, very warm relations with the Soviet Union, and that continued pretty much throughout his reign until 1991, when he was overthrown. But before getting to 1991, you had a couple of significant developments internally, mainly a war of independence by the province of then Eritrea against the government in Ethiopia. And you had a major opposition group developed in Tigray region called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. Together, the opposition in Eritrea and the TPLF with some other groups like the Oromo Liberation Front managed to topple the left-wing Mengistu government in 1991. He went into exile in Zimbabwe, was replaced in 1991 by the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF, a coalition group, which was really led by the TPLF, but it had other important members. And the primary leader in that group was Meles Zenawi, who became prime minister. The EPRDF agreed at the outset to grant independence to Eritrea, which held a referendum 2 years later and voted overwhelmingly for independence, which made Ethiopia a landlocked country. It looked like relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea were going to continue on a good track initially, and they did. But eventually, some problems began to develop, and they ultimately resulted in a conflict along the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea in 1998 that lasted in a 2-year war, very nasty war with up almost 100,000 soldiers killed in that conflict. Eventually, the war came to an end, but you had a continuation of essentially a Cold War with no diplomatic relations between the two countries. In the meantime, Ethiopia had a series of elections. The only one that was really meaningful was 2005. The others were, by and large, meaningless elections. Meles Zenawi, the leader, died of natural causes in 2012. You had a new civilian government come into place, and then yet another one in 2018, led by Abiy Ahmed, the current prime minister of Ethiopia. You had the TPLF sort of pulling back its power just into Tigray region. They realized that they were on the outs with the new government led by Abiy Ahmed. They held separate elections in Tigray in September of 2020. The elections were won by the TPLF and were followed in a couple of months later in November by an attack on the government's northern command in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, by the TPLF. And that was sort of the spark that began the current war that broke out and is still continuing as a guerrilla conflict today. And I'll stop it there. That sort of covers a lot of history in a very brief period of time, but I think that brings us up to the present.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So, Alex, if I could ask you, what is the current situation in Tigray, and what factors have led to the humanitarian crisis in the area?
So, as Ambassador Shinn pointed out, a war broke out in November. Prime Minister Abiy promised this would be a very short war. He said 10 days to a few weeks. And the first phase was indeed very swift. There was a joint offensive by the Ethiopian Defense Forces and the Eritrean Defense Forces that captured the major city, Mekelle. And any war of this type any conflict of this type will disrupt food security. And Ethiopia, as we all know, had a terrible famine back in the 1980s. And when the EPRDF came to power in 1991, in his very first press conference, Meles Zenawi was asked, what was his ambition for his time in power? And he said, Ethiopians should eat 3 meals a day. And for all its many failings, the EPRDF government actually achieved that. So that 6 years ago, there was a major drought in the country, 20 million people in need of food assistance. And the then deputy prime minister, a man called Demeke Mekonnen, as part of the EPRDF, led what was an extraordinarily effective emergency relief response, 70% of which was funded by the Ethiopians themselves. So we had a food crisis on a scale bigger than anywhere else in Africa that was successfully managed. And at the onset of the conflict 7 months ago, Ethiopia as a whole, and Tigray in particular, were food secure. This entire very sophisticated system was intact. It was comprehensively dismantled. It was disrupted by the war, but the key factor was a campaign of starvation crimes committed by the government forces, by the Eritreans, and by the militia from neighboring Amhara region that overran substantial parts of the Tigray region, parts that were contested. And there are reasons why one can say this land belongs to this side or that side, but the manner in which the Tigrayan population was driven from those areas generated a humanitarian crisis. So we have the crimes of pillage, massive looting, dismantling universities, ransacking factories, farms, shops, hotels. We have the war crime of starvation, which is defined under the Rome Statute of the ICC as destroying or rendering useless objects indispensables for survival. So this includes food. It also includes water. It also includes medical facilities. Something like 70% of the medical facilities were either ransacked or vandalized, and only less than 15% now are actually fully functional. Crops have been burned, livestock have been slaughtered. Troops are going out into the villages and telling farmers, you will not plow, you will not cultivate, you will not harvest, we will punish you if you do. And so starvation is not just a byproduct of the war, it is actually the chief weapon that is being used in this war. And another object indispensable to survival for children is maternal care. And we are seeing a massive amount of rape and sexual violence. And a survivor of rape is unable to care for herself properly or her children. And we have tens of thousands of unaccompanied children whose mothers are either in captivity, held as sexual slaves by the forces, or are recovering in hospital or in safe houses, or we simply don't know where they are. And even those mothers who have survived, imagine the anguish of knowing that their young children are not properly being cared for. They don't know where they are. So we have these starvation crimes.
I think we might have frozen here. So while we try to get Alex back online, if I can speak to you, Ambassador Shinn. Ethiopia faces additional challenges, as we know, in the region. We just spoke of Tigray, but there are disagreements with Egypt and Sudan over the Grand Renaissance Dam and a border dispute with Sudan. Can you please discuss what impact these issues have moving forward for Ethiopia and for the Horn of Africa in general?
Sure. The issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is totally separate from what is going on in Tigray, although it's a very important issue. The Sudan-Ethiopia border problem is directly related to the situation in Tigray. The dam that we're talking about is on the Blue Nile. It's about 75% completed. When finished, it would be the largest hydropower dam in all of Africa. So it does have a significant impact upon the whole Nile water question, but it only provides hydropower. It's not an irrigation type dam. Once the reservoir is filled behind the dam, the water continues to flow to downstream countries, Sudan and Egypt. And of course, Egypt is totally dependent upon the Nile River for about 95% of all of its water supply. So it's a critical issue for Egypt. The disagreement is that the Egyptians, and to some extent the Sudanese, don't want anyone upstream tampering with the water. They want basically to control it entirely. The Ethiopians say, look, most of the water originates in Ethiopia. Don't we have a right to use some of it at a minimum to produce electricity? And as a result, this is one issue on which almost all Ethiopians are in agreement, which is a pretty rare event in Ethiopia today. There's so much disagreement on so many other things in the country, but they all agree that the dam should go forward and Ethiopia has a right to the water. The problem is that the three countries are trying to work out an agreement basically orchestrated by the African Union to agree as to how to go forward with the filling of the reservoir behind the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and then how much water to release from it on an annual basis once it is filled. And that's where the whole issue is stuck today. The border issue is more straightforward. It's a long-standing issue that has come to the fore as a result of the conflict in Tigray, in part because you've had 65,000 Tigrayan refugees move into Sudan, close to the area where the border is in dispute. But it's a border dispute concerning Ethiopian farmers who have moved into an area that Sudan has long claimed and may have good claim to. And the two countries have now brought it into their conflict over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam dispute. In other words, Sudan is using it as a lever to try to gain some advantage in the dispute over the Nile waters question.
All right, thank you so much. So I see we have Alex back again.
Apologies.
No worries. So if you could please continue your thoughts.
So I'm not quite sure where I got cut off. I was explaining that the famine was brought about by a whole series of starvation crimes, and that what the situation we have at the moment is that the humanitarian access, there are about 5 million people in need, and in what the UN would classify as emergency, which is one step short of famine, about 350,000 minimum in famine conditions, which means I'm afraid that it's really too late to save the lives of several tens of thousands of children. 2/3 of those who perish will be children. Whatever happens, and in order to avoid a famine on the scale of what happened in the 1980s, which cost about 1 million lives, much more substantial effort is required. There was a call by the Biden administration and the G7 over the last week or so for a humanitarian ceasefire, and none of the parties, none of the four belligerents, the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean government, the Amhara forces, or the Tigrayan resistance, have said yes to this. And in fact, the fighting has intensified. So those in the US administration and the European Union who are seeking an effective response to this enormous humanitarian crisis are really quite stuck. The UN Security Council has, 7 months into the conflict, has not had a proper full public session on this. It has not invoked either of the two mechanisms that it might, a threat to international peace and security, or Resolution 2417, which is about armed conflict and hunger, saying this is a humanitarian emergency worthy of our attention. The reason for that inaction at the UN Security Council, which in my view is scandalous, is threats of veto by China and Russia, and the fact that the African members have lined up behind Ethiopia. Basically, they've said that we agree with the Ethiopian position, this is purely a domestic affair. Now, this is what we heard back in the 1980s. This is what we heard when governments like Rwanda were perpetrating genocide, when Mengistu regime back in the 1980s was starving its own people. And it was in response to this that the Africans developed their own norms and principles. And the United Nations adopted the responsibility to protect and so on. And it is desperately sad, worse than sad, to see these fundamental norms being essentially torn up today.
Is there anything that the international relief organizations can do? I know access is being pretty much denied, what I have read, to that region, but is there anything they can do?
They, at the moment, they are reaching a million and a half people, which is, a minority. They are short of funds, but principally they are short of that key political agreement that is needed. And without a commitment by the Ethiopian government or the Eritrean government, without a withdrawal of the Eritrean forces, which is what the Biden administration and others have called for, without some form of agreement that the lives of these civilians, especially these children, should be a priority over the political objectives or the military objectives of the parties, the humanitarians really can do very, very little.
Mm-hmm. And then Ambassador Shinn, if I could ask you, what is Eritrea hoping to gain from their actions in Tigray?
Quite frankly, I think that the government in Eritrea would like to use this situation to essentially crush Tigray. The relationship between Tigray and Eritrea has been poor for a long time. And I think President Isaias in Eritrea sees this as an opportunity to perhaps even try to take the lead role in this Ethiopian Eritrean sort of condominium that is developing. But the immediate goal is to essentially be sure that Tigray never becomes a potential threat to the future of Eritrea. You had a lot of you had a lot of Eritrean refugees that were residing in Tigray region before the conflict broke out. And the first thing the Eritrean forces did was to go to those Eritrean refugee camps and in one case destroy it and either take back to Eritrea some of the refugees or force them to disperse around Ethiopia, which I thought was a rather telling development in terms of what Eritrea is trying to accomplish there.
All right, thank you. And then this question is really for both of you. The national elections that were postponed from October 2020 will be held in a few days, but not in Tigray. And what do you think the likely results will be? And will Prime Minister Abiy remain Prime Minister? Ambassador Shinn, if you want to go first.
Well, sure. I'm perfectly willing to see what the outcome of the elections is going to be. There are several areas where the elections will not take place. They're going to be postponed in the Somali region. They're going to be postponed apparently in some parts of Oromia, which is a very large section of Ethiopia. So there are some real questions as to what all is going to be accomplished with these elections, but they're obviously going forward on the 21st, and we'll see what the outcome is. The history of elections in Ethiopia is not a very pretty picture. As I indicated earlier, the only one that had any real respect involved with it was the one in 2005, and even that one resulted in a great deal of violence after it was over. So I'm not terribly optimistic about the election, but we'll see how they turn out.
And then Alex, for the population in Tigray, since the election won't be taking place in that region, for them, there's really they have no way to express their obvious dissatisfaction, correct?
Indeed, at the moment we have a situation where the the government of Ethiopia is insistent that the TPLF will have no future at all in any form in Ethiopia. They've declared it a terrorist organization. This is a party that, when the Tigrayans ran their own elections in September, won. Now, we may disagree with the TPLF. It may have a lot of serious questions to answer about its role in Ethiopia's past. But the fact is that the Tigrayans have to be consulted, and it's not possible for them to be somehow bypassed. What I fear is developing at the moment is a sense among the Tigrayans that this is a war of extermination waged against them. So the Tigrayan sentiment really is that it is the Tigrayan people, and the TPLF is not really any longer a terribly relevant consideration for them. It is the Tigrayan people against the vision of the Ethiopian state of Prime Minister Abiy, whom we assume will win next week. And if it is a question of one or other prevailing in a military contest, then I fear what we will see is that the state of Ethiopia will actually be broken on this Tigray conflict.
So that's an interesting statement. So you're saying the unity as a country, it could cause the fragmentation, like a permanent fragmentation?
Indeed. I mean, the popular sentiment among the Tigrayans is that they want their independence. Now, we all know the route towards a province, a region of a country becoming independent is a very, very fraught and troubled one. It is not stability does not lie that way. And should the Tigrayans fight for this? At the moment, they're not. At the moment, they're fighting for self-determination, which has the theoretical option of staying within a united Ethiopia. That is the one declared war aim that they have. But should they feel that they no longer belong in Ethiopia, then it is quite possible that very many other constituencies in Ethiopia will say, we're not part of this either. And then we have a really quite scary scenario. Yugoslavia springs to mind as one example.
So Ambassador Shinn, can you comment on just what Alex was saying, how that would impact the other countries surrounding Ethiopia if indeed there was a permanent form of fragmentation?
Well, of course, the immediate concern is the potential fragmentation of Ethiopia itself. And I've argued for decades that I thought that the Ethiopians would be able to muddle through just about any situation based on their past history. They have a very long and a very proud history, and they've always managed before. And my argument has always been they will manage again. I must say I'm more concerned this time than in any previous historical period. And there is a real concern that things could break apart, maybe looking a little bit like Yugoslavia. I think that's an imperfect analogy, but there nevertheless are some lessons, I think, to be learned from the Yugoslav example. And if the Ethiopians are not careful, that kind of fragmentation could happen. And I think, in my view, that would be the worst possible outcome to what has been happening in the last 6-8 months in Ethiopia. The impact on the region would be equally great. It's really hard to know how it would play out in neighboring countries, but it would not be pretty. It would not be a positive development, I'm sure. And no matter how it played out, it would probably work differently in different areas. But I think the goal here is to try to maintain, at least from my optic, the unity of Ethiopia.
Thank you for that. Now, this question is really for both of you. What is the impact of outside influences on the region, such as China, Russia, and the United States? There was already one mention, Alex, you made about US sanctions against what's going on towards Ethiopia for what's happening in Tigray. So I don't know if you would like to take that first, the impact of China, Russia, or the United States, their influence on what is happening in Ethiopia and perhaps in Tigray.
I think one of the reasons why this has gone so high up the agenda of the Biden administration, I mean, remarkably so for an African issue, it has got a lot of very high level attention, is because the conflict is right next to the Red Sea. And the Red Sea is not only one of the world's great strategic maritime arteries, but also it has become integrated into the politics of the Middle East. We've seen with the war in Yemen and the role of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, just how volatile this wider region can be. And it's of great interest to China, because if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, if you like, the Red Sea is the buckle on the belt. And so the Chinese, they've invested heavily in Ethiopia in the past, and they have a strategic interest in this area. Now, one thing that we've seen in the recent past is that actually the different the different world powers can collaborate in this area. And the best example here is the counter-piracy initiative, Operation Atalanta, which was set up some 15 years or so ago, headed by the European Union, but involving, amongst others, the United States, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, even the Russians collaborated in what was a coordinated global security attempt to suppress piracy, which everybody saw as in their interests. And if it were possible for there to be a consensus too that this type of destabilization of the region is in nobody's interests, then I think there would be a coming together internationally. We haven't got there yet. I think privately the Chinese must be extremely worried, but at the moment they are just seeing this as an opportunity to sort of, poke at the United States. And the weak link in the chain here, I think, is the Africans. If the Africans are able to take a lead, at least in framing what a solution should look like, then it's very likely that the Chinese and the Russians would come on board. And because there's really nobody has a strategic interest here in turning this into an area of competitive proxy interference and rivalry.
Thank you, Ambassador Shinn.
Yeah, I agree with Alex's geopolitical analysis and the importance that gives to this issue for countries like the U.S., China, and Russia. In the case of the United States, there's an added issue here in terms of the Biden administration, and that is the emphasis that the administration is giving to human rights and humanitarian issues, much more so than the Trump administration did. And its concern about what is happening in Tigray. And I think the atrocities in Tigray are driving that. It's not the politics of the TPLF. The U.S., I think, could care less about the future of the TPLF, but it is very concerned about what is happening on the ground to Tigrayans in Tigray. And that is also what tends to separate it from the policies of China and Russia. Both of those countries have said this is an internal Ethiopian issue. We don't want to have anything to do with what's going on in Tigray. The Chinese have offered some humanitarian assistance to Tigray. Even that has been fairly tepid. They have made a great effort to stay out of the internal issue of Tigray itself. And Russia has not really been involved at all, one way or the other, as far as I can tell. So you have a very different approach to what's happening in Tigray from the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other.
All right, well, thank you so much for that. So now I'm going to turn to some questions from the participants. And the first question I have is for Alex, and it's learning lessons from the pattern of protracted regional intervention in Somalia. What are the potential pathways for non-securitized response to the Tigray crisis?
That's a tough one, because the currently all the measures that one would expect to put in place in these circumstances are being strenuously resisted or blocked. As I mentioned, the Ethiopian government is prioritizing what it sees as its imminent military victory over TPLF, which I think is an illusion. They've been saying this for months. It hasn't happened, over humanitarian action. So some form of pressure is needed. And at the moment, thus far, all the United States has done is put some visa restrictions on senior government officials. It's also suspended some aid. There was a suspension this time last year by the Trump administration over the Nile Dam issue. The Biden administration has kept the suspension but changed the conditions. It's no longer associated with the Nile, it's associated with the conflict in Tigray. They're also putting pressure on the multilateral development banks, the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. And this is a tricky balancing act, because Ethiopia is a poor country, it's very drought prone, and should there be, let's say, a major harvest failure across much of Ethiopia will be looking for external assistance. The Ethiopian economy is in very bad shape because most of the budget is being spent on the war, and the war and other issues of insecurity are having a major dampening effect on what was an economic success story. It's becoming increasingly perilous. So that if we had a situation like 2015 with 15 million people also in need of food assistance, it would be the major donors would be forced to step up. Ethiopia would not be able to handle that as it was able to until a few years ago. So that's a tricky tool to use. Another tool that's there in the toolbox is to have individual targeted sanctions, invoke the Global Magnitsky Act, and identify individuals or entities that are obstructing humanitarian assistance or obstructing a response to the crisis in Tigray. And that could be extremely intrusive. It could freeze a lot of the dollar transactions of Ethiopian banks, for example. And that clearly is it there in the toolbox, whether or not the Biden administration will start to use that or not. Beyond that, there are the military interventions, the Kosovo type intervention, but I don't think anyone is contemplating that at the moment.
Right, thank you. And then this question will be for Ambassador Shinn. It's from Sudan's ambassador to Canada. How can you foresee future relations on the short term among Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea with developments in the turbulent region, such as the Tigray crisis, GERD, and the border issue between Sudan and Ethiopia, and to what extent the Horn of Africa will be affected?
Well, on the border issue between Sudan and Ethiopia, as I noted, it's a very long-standing issue, and at some point it needs to be resolved. There were efforts actually to bring that issue to an end during the previous government. Unfortunately, it didn't quite get entirely dealt with. And there probably is a reasonable compromise that can be worked out that will allow the Ethiopian farmers who have been farming that section of what Sudan claims, perhaps to continue farming there, but perhaps come to some kind of an agreement that maybe it's not Ethiopian territory, or at least to decide where the boundary runs. That's really the key. The situation between Sudan and Ethiopia was actually quite cordial until the conflict in Tigray broke out, and you had this growing dispute over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. You had pressure from Egypt on Sudan to support the Egyptian position And I think the Sudanese saw this to some extent as an opportunity to use the leverage of the water issue to gain advantage on the border problem with Ethiopia. Ultimately, there is every reason for Sudan and Ethiopia to have a cordial relationship. The dam can be used to sell electricity to Sudan. It can be used to control flooding, where the Blue Nile meets the White Nile in Khartoum during the rainy season. If the water is controlled properly at the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, there's every reason in the world to have a cordial relationship between Sudan and Ethiopia. And quite frankly, I expect that eventually to be the outcome. But it's all gotten confused in the last year as a result of the outbreak of conflict in Tigray and pressure by Egypt on Sudan to follow its lead on what to do about the water issue.
If I could jump in,
yes, please.
Jump in here.
Yes, please.
I think a key factor here is Eritrea. The Eritrean leader, Isaias Afwerki, if we put dictators on a spectrum, he is right at the far end. He rules a country essentially as his personal property, as his personal garrison. He has no constitution, no rule of law, no political parties, no elections, no media. Really, the only institution that functions there is the army security apparatus. And school leavers in Eritrea go into indefinite military service. And they are brutalized, traumatized in their training. He has a huge army. And Abiy Ahmed won the Nobel Peace Prize for making peace with this man. But when the peace was made, you might have hoped for a liberalization, a demobilization of Eritrea. The threat had gone, but not at all. It was the consequence was that sanctions on Eritrea were lifted, and he used that opportunity for rearming. So it was really not a peace agreement. It was an opportunity for Isaias Afwerki, the Eritrean president, to try and impose his agenda. And his agenda is one which of really causing havoc, of keeping his own state in that particular condition, but also destabilizing not only Ethiopia, but Somalia too. He was training special forces for the Somali president in Eritrea with the aim of encouraging the Somali president to dispense with elections, to sustain himself in power, to crush regions of Somalia that wanted to retain their federal quasi-autonomous status. And I think one of the reasons why the Sudanese have been taking such a tough line on this is that he is also trying to destabilize Sudan. He is also training and arming Sudanese opposition. He's interfering, trying to disrupt what is a rather perilous transition to a democracy and civilian rule in Sudan. And really, we have at the heart of this problem is this extremely skilled, utterly ruthless rogue state, Eritrea, that is tiny, but because the entire energy and resources of the state are devoted to one agenda, which is keeping the president in power and allowing him to destabilize the region, it is a remarkably difficult actor to deal with.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question in a sense for both, either one of you or both. A commentator is saying, what a sad state of affairs that African states and presumably the AU is not yet seized with the humanitarian impact of this crisis and the risk of this conflict generating the fragmentation of Ethiopia itself. What are the prospects of these positions changing?
Well, very quickly on the role of the African Union here, it's between a rock and a hard spot in that the African Union headquarters is in Addis Ababa. It is in a very difficult position in terms of taking certainly any action of any significance against the Ethiopian government. I think it would be very reluctant to do that. Ethiopia obviously is an important member of the African Union. So it's one of these many cases in Africa where I don't see the African Union in a strong position to do much, nor does it have the resources to deal with the humanitarian problem in Tigray. It's never really been able to deal with major humanitarian crises in Africa. Those have been dealt with by the European Union, the United States, and other donor countries, and not the African Union.
I would just add to that the Sudanese Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok, in December called for a summit of the regional Northeast African states with this on the agenda. But the Ethiopian Foreign Minister and the Commissioner of the African Union, Musa Faki, essentially derailed that effort, and it led nowhere. So there's an awareness in some countries about the perils of what is happening, but there is not yet that political leadership or the political clout to allow that concern to be translated into meaningful action.
Okay, thank you. And then this question is for Alex from someone, one of our participants. And they wanted to know where you got the figure of 5 million. They wanted to know if you have some affiliation to the TPLF.
Okay, I've known leaders of the TPLF and indeed other Ethiopians for many years. My closest friends from Tigray are people who are not in TPLF, who've been thrown out of TPLF or against TPLF for many years. And there are various people who in Ethiopia for whom the facts are not acceptable, and they try and say that these facts are invented by people aligned with TPLF. The figures that I've been using are ones that come from the United Nations. The United Nations figure is at the moment 5.2 million people in need of food assistance in Ethiopia, 350,000 in famine conditions. The UN says these figures are underestimates, especially the famine conditions, that they were not able to reach approximately 1.5 million people who live in areas under the effective control of the Tigray Defense Forces, who are not receiving any assistance. And I would just add, I mean, there's an interesting sort of political angle here that is often missed. The leader of the Tigray Defense Forces is an Ethiopian general called Tzadkan Gebretensai. He left TPLF 20 years ago, fierce critic of TPLF. He was an intermediary between Prime Minister Abiy and the TPLF trying to prevent this war. He was highly critical of both sides. And then when the war turned from a limited operation into what he says a war against the Tigrayan people, he went and with a number of his fellow veterans from back in the 1980s, rejoined. I mean, these are men in their 60s, they're retired people walking with sticks. And they are the ones who are actually mobilizing the resistance. The TPLF is only part of this. It is essentially a mobilization of the Tigrayan people who feel that they are being systematically shut out of any role in Ethiopia, that the Prime Minister sees Tigray as somehow just a bump on the road to a greater Ethiopia, and that you can dispense with these 5 million people. And that is quite a terrifying prospect. And that is why people such as General Tzadkan, who is a national figure, he's of Tigray, but a national figure, are now those who are actually leading the Tigrayan resistance.
Okay, thank you for that. I have another question. While the elections this Monday are considered a foregone conclusion in terms of domestic support for the Prosperity Party, do any of you view any changes to the post-electoral calculus for the PP that would better allow them to finally have the political base to handle some of the domestic and regional crises such as the dam? In essence, could we see the elections allowing them to accept less politically palatable deals that could turn some of these crises, quote unquote, off? I don't know who would like to start.
Silence. I'll comment on it, but I'm not sure I have a very helpful response to it. First, I'm not totally convinced that the elections are a foregone conclusion. There may be some surprises in the election. The problem is that we know, because of some of the areas that are not voting, that there are going to be flaws in the electoral process. So that's a given. The question is, how flawed will the elections be? And if there are flaws that can be rectified in the short term, then that's not all bad. But I don't think we really know how these elections are going to turn out. I think a lot will be told in terms of the percentage of turnout. How many people actually vote is almost as important as for whom they vote. So we could have a lot of surprises all the way around here. I'm not expecting a great deal and on the positive side of the ledger, but I would like to be very pleasantly surprised.
All right. Another question, is there the possibility that the border dispute between Ethiopia and Sudan affect the UN peacekeeping mission in Abyei, as all the forces come from Ethiopia? If yes, can this lead to conflict with South Sudan and Sudan again? Alex, would you like to take a?
So there are a couple of issues here. One actually is the issue about the status of Ethiopian forces in peacekeeping operations in general, because there is a human rights due diligence that has to be done for a country to provide troops for peacekeeping. And Ethiopia has been the major troop contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, but that's now under review because of the level of abuses in Tigray. So Ethiopia faces the scenario that Sri Lanka did some 13, 14 years ago, where it could be debarred from peacekeeping. So there would be no Ethiopian peacekeeping at all, because the UN would simply determine that the Ethiopian army does not have a good enough human rights record. And we are headed that way very, very fast. There's a second aspect here, which is that you have Ethiopian troops of Tigrayan origin in these peacekeeping operations, some of whom have already sought asylum. So that a number of those in Abyei have already sought asylum in Sudan. And under the current conditions, it's not likely that they will be sitting idle. It's likely that they would be recruited clandestinely or openly into the Tigray resistance or some other resistance forces. So we could see this seeding of proxy conflicts. And then there's the specific question of whether the withdrawal of the peacekeeping force in Abyei would lead to conflict between Sudan and South Sudan. And I would just say one thing on that, which is that relations currently between Sudan and South Sudan are pretty good. Relations between the communities in those areas are perhaps not so good. So there is some need for peacekeeping, but probably not at the level that it was a few years ago.
I would only add that you actually have 3 UN peacekeeping operations in Sudan. One is in Darfur, which is coming to an end. I believe it will shut down by the end of June. So that issue basically disappears. Alex described the situation in Abyei, which is almost exclusively Ethiopian forces. And then you have a third UN peacekeeping operation in South Sudan. And I believe there are Ethiopians that are assigned to that operation also. And the whole Tigrayan question would get into that. The other issue with that South Sudan issue is you have several 100,000 South Sudanese refugees living inside Ethiopia. You actually have more Sudanese refugees in Gambela region than you have Ethiopian residents of Gambela living in Gambela. So you have a lot of issues here that come into play.
Thank you so much. There's another question here regarding the Ethiopian constitution. And the participant wants to know about the ethnic religious points of the Ethiopian constitution and what impact this has had on the wider conflict. Alex, you look like you might be ready to.
This is one of the most contentious issues in Ethiopian politics. Actually, not the religious issue, but the ethnic issue. Because Ethiopia, as Ambassador Shinn said at the beginning, was an empire. It was a conquest state in which a certain military, martial, feudal aristocracy overran, conquered, subjugated other peoples. And the question about the equality of, or the status of these different cultural, linguistic, ethnic groups in Ethiopia was one of the factors that led both to the revolution and then to the wars against the Marxist regime in the 1970s and 1980s. The Federal Constitution of 1991, which was jointly, in fact, one of the key drafters was from the Oromo Liberation Front, was jointly put together by a number of groups with the Tigrayans at the head, was an attempt to resolve this. It has numerous problems, both in the framework and also in the implementation. But opening it up again is in many ways opening a Pandora's box of disputes. It has to be handled with great delicacy, and it can't be handled, surely cannot be handled in the context of ongoing armed conflicts and atrocities. There has to be a way of getting to some sort of national dialogue on the basis of some tolerance and civic acceptance of the other.
Thank you. And I have another question here, and actually it's probably for Alex. Is there the prospect that the ongoing campaign of deliberate starvation, rape, pillaging of hospitals, etc., by the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea, if it were continued, could it be considered a campaign of genocide against the Tigrayan people?
There's a one-word answer to that, and it's yes.
Okay, all right. And then there's another one asking, is there a difference in the war tactics of Eritrean, Amharan, and Ethiopian forces, which has not been reported and detailed? They suggest it's because they're saying Eritrea is dismantling the decades of work and civil society. So this is their question. Ambassador Shinn?
I think that there are important differences here, and I can't really comment on the Amhara militia. I don't know enough about them or what they're doing in the region. But there are differences between the Eritrean Defense Forces and the Ethiopian National Defense Force. If you look at most of the allegations of rape and of sexual abuse of women, more of them seem to be attached to the Eritrean forces than the Ethiopian forces. Both are involved, but it seems to be the Eritrean forces that are more deeply involved. The Eritreans the troops seem to be running pretty roughshod over Tigray, and that doesn't surprise me in view of the animosity between the government of Eritrea and Tigray region. If I could comment, there was a question in the chat box that is sort of related to this. It asked, why is the Ethiopian military, which has a reputation for being so strong, why is it calling or using the Eritrean military to help it out? And that's a very important and interesting question. I think there are several reasons for that. One, the Eritrean troops are closer to Tigray. They're right next door, so it's easy for them to come in and help out. It's just logistically simpler to move them into Tigray. But more importantly, I think that you're seeing in the Ethiopian military, particularly at the lower ranks, the same issues of ethnic division and dispute and conflict that you're seeing in the rest of the country. And I think that the Ethiopian military today is not the military that we knew 2 years ago or 3 years ago. It's not as strong as it once was. It's not as coherent as it once was. And I think there's probably less agreement in the government of Ethiopia that it is as strong as it once was. Hence, this is a good time to bring in the Eritrean military, which is probably more united at the moment.
Well, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. And I wanted to thank Ambassador Shinn and Professor Alex de Waal for joining us today. And Courtney, I will turn it over to you.
Yes, yeah, thank you both. This is, I think, a really important issue. It's actually, speaking of history, the famine in the 80s was actually what got me interested in international affairs in the beginning. So thank you. I think these are very tough topics, so I really appreciate your time today. And thank you, Joanna, for moderating the audience, for all the terrific questions.
Thank you for listening to Network 2020's audio edition of this virtual briefing. Click on the link in the description below to view all of our upcoming events and find out how you can become a member and gain access to our members-only benefits.